We are very excited for our 2021 regulatory update webinar today. We have been hosting these regulatory update events for my 15 years here, and certainly well. By the way, I should note that this is Christy Blevins. I manage the regulatory department here at Wetland Studies. We have had over 600 people register for this event and could not be more happy with the turnout. Special thanks to all our speakers this afternoon. Our registration numbers for this event are so high because of the great panel we have lined up for today. I apologize in advance if you hear my 5-year-old asking for a snack or the dogs barking. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this situation. A couple of things to note. If you are not already familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, there's a toolbar that you'll see next to your screen where you see my slides. If you hit the orange arrow on that, it'll expand the control panel, and then you can expand that control panel further with the little grips. That way you can see the questions better and type in questions and type in information into the chat. Also, this webinar qualifies for continuing education credits for PEs as well as professional wetland scientists. To get your certificate for those credits, you need to fill out the evaluation at the end of the webinar, which will be emailed to you. We will also be asking a few polling and trivia questions throughout. So for those that answer the trivia questions correctly first, you will win some free gear. This is our schedule for today. We'll kick off the afternoon with the regulatory updates regarding nationwide permits and individual 401 certification. Once all of our session 1 speakers have presented, we'll take questions. So feel free to submit your questions throughout the program. We will do our best to get to all of the questions, but please do bear with us. We plan to take a quick break around 3 after the Q&A in session 1. When we come back from our break, we'll get started with our session 2 speakers. All right. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce all of our session 1 folks. If you guys don't mind turning your cameras on just so we can say hi. Make sure everybody's out there. Hello, hello. Okay, so we've got Dave Olson, the Regulatory Program Manager at Core Headquarters. He's going to give us an update on the nationwide permits from a national perspective. We also have Jennifer Serafin, the Western Virginia Regulatory Section Chief in the Norfolk District. She's going to cover the Norfolk perspective on the 2021 nationwides and the 401 certification. Tom Walker, from the Norfolk District Regulatory Branch Chief, as well as Tucker Smith, the Northern Virginia Regulatory Section Chief, are also with us today to help answer questions. Justin Curtis, the Vice President of Aqualaw, will provide an overview of the 401 certification rule finalized by EPA and effective last fall. Tricia Beasley is with DEQ, the Virginia Water Protection. She is a Virginia Water Protection Program Manager at the Northern Regional Office. She's going to discuss Virginia's response to the 401 certification rule and the navigable waters rule. And last but certainly not least, we have Heather Nelson. She is the program manager at MDE, the Wetlands and Waters program, and she is going to provide an update on Maryland's response to the 401 certification rule, navigable waters, and the SPGP6. So if everyone wants to turn their cameras back off, we're going to do a quick polling question, and then we'll get started with Dave Olson. So if you can just let us know where you are joining us from. Ooh, it looks like a lot of outside nova. Great. Dave, if you want to share your screen. There you go.
Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Shrink the window first. But anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the 2021 nationwide permits. So I'd like to give an overview of the changes that we made at the nationwide permit program in January 2021, and what will be coming next in terms of the remaining nationwide permits, so that we can have a new set of nationwide permits hopefully by the end of this year. So some general background on the nationwide permits. Nationwide permits are general permits that are issued by Corps headquarters authorized activities across the country. Those activities must have no more than minimal individual and cumulative adverse environmental effects. Because of the statutory language in the Clean Water Act, we can only issue nationwide permits and other general permits for a 5-year period. And each time we go to reissue the nationwide permits and add new nationwide permits, you have to go through a rulemaking activity under the Administrative Procedure Act, with review by the Office of Management Budget in Washington, D.C. and other headquarters agencies. The nationwide permit program is a big part of our regulatory program. We authorize roughly 75% of the activities each year through the nationwide permit program. About 35,000 of those activities are reported to Corps districts each year, and we estimate that approximately 30,000 activities occur through non-reporting nationwide permits. The first nationwide permits were issued in 1977, and we've reissued them every 5 years. There have been times when we have issued out-of-cycle nationwide permits, and that's occurred 3 times previously. So the January 2021 nationwide permits were the 4th time we've issued nationwide permits out of cycle. The nationwide permit program has been a valuable tool in helping provide incentives for people to reduce impacts when they do activities that require Corps authorization. The vast majority of activities authorized by nationwide permits impact less than 1/10 of an acre. And as you get towards larger impacts, the number of activities that have those larger impacts declines. Although you do see a bit of a bump between 1 and 5 acres, and a lot of those are due to restoration activities, toxic and hazardous waste cleanup, and things like that, that for nationwide permits that don't have any acreage limits. So what we see the nationwide permit program's value is it helps people avoid and minimize impacts in exchange for that streamlined authorization compared to the individual permit process. So as I mentioned before, the nationwide permit reissuance is a rulemaking activity. So we published a proposed rule in the Federal Register for public comment. At the same time, our Corps districts proposed regional conditions that would further restrict use of those nationwide permits in particular geographic regions. They solicit comment on proposed regional conditions. We also reach out to water state and tribal certifying authorities under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act for water quality certification for the issuance of those nationwide permits. And in states that have coastal zone programs, our districts also reach out to the states for coastal zone management consistency currents for the proposed nationwide permits. We issued a final rule for 16 nationwide permits in January of 2021. Those nationwide permits went into effect on March 15th of this year. They are scheduled to expire on March 14th, 2026. We are in the process of preparing a separate final rule for the remaining 40 existing nationwide permits that weren't included in the January 2021 final rule. We also plan on making a decision on the proposed new nationwide permit E for water reclamation and reuse facilities. Once those nationwide permits go through the review process in Washington, D.C., and they get cleared by the Office of Management Budget for publication in the Federal Register, they will go into effect 60 days later. And after those final nationwide permits are issued, our core divisions will finalize regional conditions for those 40 nationwide permits. So why did we finalize these 16 nationwide permits in January? This effort was the result of several years of work between the Corps, agencies, and the public to help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the nationwide permit program, while helping to ensure that environmental protections remain in place. We look to simplify the terms and conditions of these nationwide permits so that they continue to provide incentives to reduce impacts, to get under that 1/10 of an acre in many cases, to qualify for that streamlined permit process at lower cost. We prioritize these 60 nationwide permits because they are an effective tool for helping the public work through this pandemic. There's going to be some building that needs to be done to address utilities and other types of infrastructure, and as well as buildings for education and such. So, and these nationwide permits are sort of key to that. So we identified these nationwide permits and the potential efficiencies that could be achieved by issuing them in advance of the normal 5-year cycle. But they're also important for other activities like food production, electric and telecommunications lines, and water utility lines. So this slide shows the 12 existing nationwide permits that we reissued, and also the 4 new nationwide permits that we issued in January 2021. And this slide shows all the remaining 40 nationwide permits that we still have to take action on, hopefully before the end of this year. Those 40 existing nationwide permits remain to effect under their 2017 terms and conditions. And they were currently scheduled to expire on March 18, 2022, but if we reissue them and they go into effect before that date, then we will change the expiration date of those 2017 nationwide permits. The 40 nationwide permits are still governed by those 2017 nationwide permit general conditions and definitions. So in other words, the nationwide permit general conditions that we modified in January 2021, as well as the definitions, don't apply those 2017 nationwide permits. Our goal is when we get the 40 nationwide permits reissued, then those revised general conditions and definitions will apply to the reissued nationwide permits. For those districts that have regional conditions on the 40 nationwide permits, those regional conditions that were approved by division engineers in 2017 still remain in effect. And we plan on using the proposed rule that was published in September 15, 2020 to finalize those 40 nationwide permits. We don't have any intention of going out for another round of comments on those 40 nationwide permits. We'll just continue the rulemaking process, even though the nationwide permits have been split up a bit. So as we transition from the 2017 nationwide permits to the 2021 nationwide permits, as I mentioned before, those 12 existing 2017 nationwide permits that were reissued in January 2021 expire on March 14th. The reason why we changed the expiration date for the 2017 nationwide permits that we reissued in January was that we can't have 2 sets of nationwide permits in effect at the same time. The 40 existing nationwide permits that weren't reissued in January 2021 will continue to be in effect at least until March 18th of 2022, unless we reissue them before then. But for people that have nationwide permit verifications in hand, there's 2 different routes that they can go in terms of having their activities still remain authorized by the nationwide permit. So one of the grandfather provisions in our nationwide permit regulations is that if we reissue a nationwide permit and the project proponent had a verification issued on the prior set of nationwide permits, but the activity still complies with the nationwide permits that were reissued, then their verification is still in effect until the verification letter issued by the district expires. However, if that activity no longer qualifies for one of the reissued nationwide permits, then the activity remains authorized by the prior nationwide permit for at least a year from the expiration date, as long as that project proponent has either commenced construction, in other words, started doing the regulated activity or the permit activity, and or is under contract. So we have that 1-year grandfather provision if the nationwide permits change so that people still have time to complete their authorized activities. And so either of these scenarios could apply in terms of keeping that project authorized under nationwide permit. So one of the changes in the 2021 nationwide permits was the removal of the 300 linear foot for losses of stream bed, and it would apply to these 10 nationwide permits. And I'll go a little bit more detail about those changes and why we made that change. So there are several reasons why we looked at removing this 300 linear foot limit and using other tools to comply with a no more than minimal adverse environmental effects requirement for the nationwide permits. And we'll talk about those in the next slide. So one of the reasons we made this change was for more accurate quantification of losses of stream bed. We recognize that streams within watersheds vary substantially in size, and one of the first steps in making defensible determinations of no more than minimal impacts on an individual and cumulative basis is accurately quantifying how much stream bed is lost. And in the parlance of the nationwide permit program, filling an excavation of stream bed is what causes the loss of stream bed. So in order to make those more defensible determinations of no more than minimal impacts, we first need to accurately quantify what's being lost as a result of the nationwide permit activity. We also looked at reducing costs for permittees in the Corps and remove delays due to interagency coordination of waiver requests, and also looking at increasing the availability of nationwide permits to authorize small losses of stream bed instead of requiring individual permits for these activities. Another objective was to provide consistent limits for all categories of non-tidal waters, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. Also, another objective was to provide consistency with the 404B1 guidelines, which provide greater protection for special aquatic sites such as wetlands. And also, we established a commensurate mitigation requirement for losses of greater than 3/100ths of an acre of stream bed to be consistent with the wetland mitigation requirement that's been in the nationwide permit general condition 23 for a number of years. And this mitigation requirement that we established for losses of stream bed is we view as an additional incentive to reduce stream bed impacts. Sort of along the lines with that bar chart I showed you earlier, where the vast majority of authorized impacts by nature permits are less than 1/10 of an acre. And that 1/10 of an acre happens to be the wetland mitigation threshold in the general conditions. So some of the tools that we would continue to use to ensure no more than minimal adverse effects for the 10 nationwide permits is that half-acre limit for losses of non-tidal waters. Also, most of these nationwide permits require pre-construction notification for all activities. The two exceptions are nationwide permit 3 for stormwater management activities, which does not require PCNs for certain maintenance activities, and nationwide permit 51 for land-based renewable energy generation facilities, which require PCNs for losses of greater than 1/10 of an acre. Also, our division engineers have ability to impose regional conditions to further restrict the use of these nationwide permits to address regional aquatic resource concerns and ensure no more than minimal adverse effects in the region. And finally, our district engineers have the ability to add activity-specific conditions to those nationwide permits to address project-specific resource concerns. So to try to put a quantitative face on this, this chart shows the different types of acreage impacts that could occur. So for wetlands, which are a special aquatic site, these nationwide permits authorize losses of no more than half an acre. So if you take the average width of a first order non-tidal stream, one study shows that it's about a little bit more than a foot wide. Another study shows it's about 2.6 feet wide. If you translate that over to 300 linear feet, then you have an effective acreage limit of 7/1000th of an acre in the first study, and 200ths of an acre for the second study. A substantial difference from half an acre. So this gets towards the equivalence that we're trying to achieve in terms of the limits that apply to these different categories of waters and provide efficiency to the nationwide permit program, and rely on those other tools as a way of ensuring no more than minimal adverse effects. Just another very simple graphic example is if you look at a first order headwater stream with an average width of 2.6 feet versus a fourth order stream with an average of about 27 feet, the impact over 300 linear feet is a factor of 9.5, which is a substantial difference. So again, we're trying to get at more accurate quantification of those stream bed impacts. Another substantial change that we made in the 2021 nature permits in January was changing nature permit 12 utility lines, which has been one of our most commonly used nationwide permits, and limiting that to oil or natural gas pipeline activities. We retained the half-acre limit for this nationwide permit. We also simplified the pre-construction notification requirements. Prior versions of nationwide permit 12 had 7 pre-construction notification thresholds, and we simplified it down to 3. We also added a new notification requirement for oil and gas pipelines that are more than 250 miles in length. We also issued 2 new nationwide permits to authorize utility lines for different sectors. Nationwide permit 57 for electric utility line and telecommunications activities. Nationwide permit 58 for utility line activities for water and other substances. The structure of these nationwide permits is generally the same. We have different definitions for the type of utility lines that they are. We retain the half-acre limit for each of these nationwide permits, and we have the 2 notification thresholds for losses of a greater than 1/10 of an acre and crossings of navigable waters. Nationwide permit 48 has been subject to litigation, and so we made some changes to try to address some of that litigation. That was another reason why we focused on those 16 nationwide permits, is because 2 of those nationwide permits were subject to a lot of litigation over the past few years, and so we're trying to address those so that we can move forward and hopefully be able to defend these nationwide permits better in the future. So one change we made to the commercial shellfish mariculture nationwide permit is to add pre-construction notification requirement for new and ongoing activities that directly affect more than half an acre of submerged aquatic vegetation. We also tried to clarify our authorities for regulating these activities under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act versus Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. We also issued 2 new mariculture nationwide permits to help provide additional tools to enhance food production in the nation. Nationwide permit 55 is for seaweed mariculture activities, and nationwide permit 56 for finfish mariculture activities. And both of these nationwide permits author structures in navigable waters, marine estuarine waters, including waters on the outer continental shelf for producing seaweed and for finfish. We also added provisions that authorize multi-trophic mariculture activities. In other words, growing seaweed and mussels together, or growing finfish, seaweed, and mussels together. And one of the benefits of multi-trophic mariculture is it helps reduce pollutants, especially with finfish and the substances that they excrete, and those can be uptaken by seaweed and by mussels that help reduce pollution. We also add provisions that require the project owner to remove these structures if they're no longer using them for mariculture. One of the protective measures in our nationwide program is the ability for division engineers to add regional conditions to nationwide permits, so they can modify, suspend, or revoke nationwide permits on a regional basis to comply with that no more than minimal adverse effects requirement for the nationwide permits. To start the regional conditioning process, when the Corps proposes to reissue nationwide permits, the district issues public notices on proposed regional conditions. They approve regional conditions through supplemental documentation that's prepared by districts and signed by divisions. Then they issue public notices announcing those final regional conditions. The regional conditions can only make the nature permits more restrictive in terms of lowering impact limits. They can have pre-construction notification requirements where the national text of the nature permit doesn't require those notification, or they can restrict or prohibit the use of nature permits in certain categories of waters. The supplemental documents also address the status of water quality certification and coastal zone consistency for those nationwide permits. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Christy. Thank you very much for your time today.
Great, thank you, Dave. That was great. A lot of information there. We are going to move on to the Norfolk District nationwide perspective with Jennifer Serafin.
All right.
There we go. Jennifer, if you're able to get it in presentation mode.
Yep.
I know. No pressure at all with these
No.
500 something people we have.
Yeah. Yeah. There we go.
Great,
Okay.
perfect. You
Okay.
got it.
So good afternoon, everybody. I am Jennifer Serafin. I'm the chief of the Western Virginia Regulatory Section for the Norfolk District. And Mr. Walker is also available and online, I believe, too. But I'm going to be the one running through the slides today. Provided. There we go. So Dave did a great job, and as he always does, in running through the nationwides and the changes and everything. So and really for the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is just some of the main key changes to the 2021 permits, the regional conditions for us for the purposes of this presentation. So, essentially for the 2017, the 40 remaining nationwide permits, there's no change to our regulatory processes in the Norfolk district. So, relative to the changes of the 401 and everything, so that's not changed. So we are going to focus, like I said, for this presentation, we're going to talk about the 12 reissued and the 4 new permits, and specifically going to talk about the 401 water quality certification and the CZMA consistency concurrence. So we have a regional condition 13 that we added to these 2021 nationwides. And so regional condition 13, so as an applicant, as it would go, if you have one of those 15 nationwides that are listed there and highlighted in yellow, and you obtain either a VWP permit from DEQ, an individual Section 401 water quality certification, or a waiver from DEQ, you meet that regional condition 13. And you'll see, so there's only of the new ones, there's only 15 there. So there are special conditions, nationwide specific conditions for nationwide 12. And also, in addition to regional condition 13, these other nationwides at the bottom, they also have specific thresholds that go sort of above and beyond what regional condition 13 has. All right, so to be clear, one of the main things I really want to get across to everyone is the differences as we work through this with the water quality certifications is the difference between what is considered a general water quality certification for the nationwides versus what is an individual water quality certification. So for the 2021 nationwides, except for nationwide 12, because that falls into a slightly different category. So number one, if your project complies with regional condition 13, meaning you obtain a VWP or a waiver from DEQ, and you do not exceed any of those nationwide specific 401 thresholds, and those are specific conditions of each of those nationwides, then your project complies with the general water quality certification. And there's there's nothing additional that's needed on behalf of the applicant. This does not you don't get into the pre-filing requirements. There's no coordination with EPA because that is the general certification. So if you have nationwide 12, because like I said, that's a little bit special. So in this case, if you are not applying for a FERC license for a gas line that is greater than 36 inches in diameter, and you comply with a nationwide specific condition under that nationwide permit, meaning you obtain a VWP or a waiver from DEQ, then again, your project complies with that general water quality certification, and there's no additional steps are needed to be taken. All right, so for this general water quality process, water quality certification process, so the Corps and DEQ, Virginia DEQ, we're working together to try and develop some efficiency and streamlining for the public and the applicants, and actually for each other, project managers for the Corps as well as DEQ, to help kind of move these processes along and make it very clear to everybody involved on what the waiver means, what the VWP, how the VWP relates to the 401 and vice versa. And so when the Corps project managers. So when we receive an application under the 2021 nationwides, and and we have to make assurances prior to us issuing a verification or rendering a permit decision for those nationwides, we need to have assurances that that general certification requirement is, if the applicant is complying with that or the project complies with that general certification, or that applicant has obtained an individual 401 water quality certification. So what we're going to do, so when we get these applications, we're going to send what's considered a provisional notification letter to the applicants that will say that we cannot verify the use of that nationwide until we receive assurance from you, the applicant, that your project complies with either that general certification requirement or you have obtained an individual water quality certification. So what is the individual water quality certification and when does this apply? Because I think this is the bulk of lots of angst out there amongst everybody. So for the Corps, you know, as the federal agency, and I know that the next couple of the other presenters are going to be talking about more in depth about the 401, the new 401 regulation. But in essence, for us, when there's a Corps individual permit, it will require an individual 401 water quality certification. And also an individual 401 will be required when in those 2021 nationwides, when you exceed those permits, the project exceeds those permit specific 401 thresholds. A note there is, you know, even if the project is a Section 10 only activity, meaning Section 10 under the Rivers and Harbors Act, and no discharge of dredged or filled material under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, it's still, that project is still required to adhere to the 401 water quality program. And so all of these, when there is an individual 401 that is required, it has to adhere to the 2020 Section 401 regulation that was published last year and went into effect in September 11th, 2020. So what is that process? Step one is the applicants make a request to the certifying authority, and in the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, the certifying authority for the 401 program is the Virginia DEQ. So that is a required process or required step that applicants have to take. And the following two slides, it talks about the required elements for this request. So in essence, so there has to be, you make this request to the DEQ for a pre-filing meeting. And within 30 days have to elapse between the time you make that request to DEQ before you can submit for your request for certification to DEQ. So we recommend that you copy, the applicant copies the Corps when you make that pre-filing meeting request. You don't have to, but we certainly encourage it. Keep us kind of in the loop. You can submit this pre-filing request in conjunction with your JPA, or but keep in mind that you still have to wait that 30 days before you officially request an individual 401 from DEQ. Another thing to keep in mind, even though the certifying authority, DEQ, if they choose to, they can decline your pre-filing meeting. They can not even acknowledge it if they don't have time, but you still have to wait the 30 days. Even if the certifying authority says, no, we decline a pre-filing meeting, we don't have time, or we don't feel that it's warranted, you still have to wait that 30 days before you submit officially for a 401 water quality certification. So here is a sample cover sheet, if you will. It's not a form, it's nothing official, but this is something that we put together to assist the public and making sure that when you're submitting your pre-filing meeting request, is that you're hitting on all of the key components and the required elements from the 401 regulation. So this is just something, and I believe a copy of this is going to be provided to the attendees. So this is something that you can use. So you just basically, you can go through, you can check which DEQ office, which Corps section that perhaps your project is in, project proponent, and you give a brief overview of your project and anticipated timeline. So all this is doing is giving you a concise format, so you don't have to constantly go back to the regulation and make sure you're hitting all the points. We're just kind of trying to provide that for you to use. It's not a required document. Like I said, it's just a sample tool that you can use when submitting for a pre-filing meeting. So step 2, and so say the 30 days has come and gone, and now you're ready to submit for a 401 water quality certification to DEQ. There are required elements that have to be part of that request as well, and that's the next few slides. The applicant must, and this is where you have to copy the Corps on this request. This is a required component that the federal agency, in this case, I'm speaking for the Corps as the permittee or the permitter, so that you have to provide documentation that you did submit a pre-filing meeting request and that 30 days has elapsed. If this is via emails, that you can show that we submitted an email to DEQ on this day and it's been over 30 days, and here we are. You can submit, this can also be submitted as part of your JPA, and we are certainly encouraging and recommending that all applicants go through the JPA process. I know there are instances where pre-construction notifications come directly to Corps project managers, but in order to get DEQ in the loop and involved in the project process early on, we're certainly encouraging everybody to use the JPA process, and which goes to the VMRC as the initial starting point and clearinghouse, and then we all get it through that. So this can be your version of requesting for the water quality certification and using this the JPA as part of that. So within 15, so the reason why the Corps has to be copied on that request is because we have 15 days that we have to establish and notify the certifying authority, which is DEQ, of the reasonable period of time of which they need to act on that request. And then we will copy, and we will do this in a letter format. Some of you may have already seen it because we have done this a handful of times thus far. And then we will copy the applicant on what we established that reasonable period of time to be. Right now, the standard is 60 days. And there certainly can be options and where DEQ can ask for a longer period of time, but it is not to exceed 1 year. So when making your 401 water quality certification request, this is actually when you're applying for 401 certification. Here is the standard elements. Again, this is just a sample cover sheet that you can use. Attach it to your JPA if you're using that as your mechanism to apply for the 401. But these are the key components that by regulation have to be part of that request to actually qualify for that request and meet that regulation. So very similar to the pre-filing meeting request. And so there are things that you have to identify: the location of the discharge, the nature of the discharge. I know some of this information is already in a JPA, and I don't think anybody has really any heartburn if you say see section whatever of the JPA, but this might give you an opportunity to kind of narrow down and really, streamline that request per the 401 regulation. And this one actually just has to be three pages long, and there is that clause there, the signature at the end, is that you're just basically, the project proponent is certifying that everything there is complete and true and accurate to the best of their knowledge. Okay. All right, next, so step 3, we're into step 3. So we're in that reasonable period of time, whether it's 60 days or whatever that the Corps has given to DEQ. This is their review and their processing time. So the decisions that they can make is they can either grant the 401 water quality certification, they can grant it with conditions, they can deny that 401 request, or they can expressly waive it, meaning they actually will send you something that says, we waive this. We waive the 401 certification. If the certifying authority does not act within the reasonable period of time, the Corps presumes waiver of the 401. So this is the implicit one. This is where if we don't hear from DEQ, then that is it. We can presume that is waived, and then we can proceed with our permitting decision. So step 4, so this is us. So if the water quality certification is granted with or without conditions, the Corps has 5 calendar days from receipt of that water quality certification, and keeping in mind, if we have an application for Department of Army authorization, we have that 5 calendar days to notify the EPA. and for us, this would be Region 3 of the EPA. We notify them, and we have a process established with them where we do it electronically. They have an email Dropbox, if you will. And so the EPA has 30 calendar days from the time they receive it to determine if the proposed activity that has been certified by DEQ would affect any neighboring jurisdiction. And if they do determine that there is an effect to a neighboring jurisdiction, the regulation talks about some other steps that I'm not going into just based on time for this, but certainly can expand on that at some point, or if there's questions later, we can talk about that. But they, like I said, they have 30 calendar days. And I know timing is of the essence for a lot of applicants, so just be aware of that. Now, they can respond sooner in that 30 days and say that they have determined there's no effect, so then we would be able to proceed. So if the water quality certification is waived, then that is another option that the certifying authority has, whether it's expressly waived or implicitly. The Corps does not have to notify EPA. There is no notification to that point, and we can proceed with rendering our permit decision at that point. If the water quality certification is denied by the certifying authority, the Corps, again, we don't have to notify EPA of a denial, but we can't issue our Department of Army authorization without water quality certification. So that's the 401 changes relative to the nationwides, and a little bit of an overview of the individual 401 process. I'm just going to touch on the regional condition really briefly about the CZMA, because this is a change to the regional conditions now for those 2021 nationwides that we have. So in order for the project to qualify for that nationwide, this condition has to be complied with by applicants. So, and this is only applicable for those activities that are located within Virginia's designated coastal zone. So if, you know, the burden is on the applicant or the agent in this case to identify if there is a state listed species or designated resource that is known within 2 miles of the proposed activity that is being authorized. So if it does, then you as the applicant or agent has to coordinate with DWR's environmental services section, and you are to allow them 30 days for review and comment. If 30 days comes and goes, and you don't hear back from them, and you provide us documentation, the Corps, you provide the Corps project managers that look, sent this information to DWR, haven't heard back, it's been 30 days, then that's for us, you've met that condition, and we can move out with our permit decision. If in that 30 days, DWR comes back with something that they say we can't accept this, or you have to do something else, essentially what that means then is that your project does not have that federal, or like that nationwide that was issued does not have federal consistency concurrence from DEQ. So this means we would then everybody would have to go back to DEQ and for an actual CZMA process, a formal process through, it would not meet that consistency, that federal consistency. So for those projects where the regional condition is applicable, and meaning where it's applicable would be in the coastal area, the Corps again cannot verify the use of that 2021 nationwide until such time that DWR coordination is complete. Without the DWR coordination, the nationwide does not have concurrence on the Corps CZMA consistency determination. And so then upon applicant's assurance to the Corps that you've completed that process, we can move out with our review and permit decision for that nationwide permit. So here's just a few, and I'm sort of wrapping up. So here's just a few little extras that I put in there. So your VWP permit issued in compliance with Regional Condition 13 does not become a condition of the Corps' nationwide permit verification. The Regional Condition 13 in effect is the general certification. So the VWP is not a condition per se, like all of the terms and conditions of that VWP does not become enforceable conditions by the Corps of Engineers. Conversely, if there is an individual water quality certification, that does become a condition of the Corps' authorization, because there is the difference. That is the individual 401 water quality certification, and those conditions that are relevant to water quality are the only ones that are enforceable by the Corps as part of our authorization. And then lastly, the Corps' obligations, regardless of the 401 processes that are out there now relative to the nationwide and our individual permits, our obligations for Section 7, Section 106, Section 408 coordination, and all the consultations and things that go along with that, we proceed with those regardless of the type of 401, whether it's general or individual, and the stage of which those are in. So there's in essence, what I'm trying to reassure you all as applicants and agents for project proponents is that we're not stopping our processes. If we have to initiate consultation with VDHR or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we're going to proceed with that while all of this other 401 stuff is going on as well, so that we're moving forward. We're not just waiting until one step's done and then we move on to the other. So trying to keep everything moving along as quickly as we can as regulations allow. And that is all I have.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. Again, lots of good information there, and I think we'll have a really good question and answer session. We have a quick poll. How would you describe your workplace, to see where folks are joining us? And also, I'll note the sample, I won't call them forms, but the sample non-form forms are in the handout slide of the program, so you guys should be able to see those there. Lots of consultants. And also our course summary is in the handout section of the control panel as well. Justin is up next if you want to load your slides.
All right. Are they showing up, Christy?
I see them. It looks like I'm seeing the two panel view. Yeah. It's always fun.
How's that?
There we go. Perfect.
Excellent. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Justin Curtis going to talk about 401 water quality certification. Actually, a lot of what I've covered, or a lot of what's in the presentation materials here, Jennifer covered, and I will not repeat everything that Jennifer said. I'll just hit a couple of the highlights, maybe from a more practical perspective, and in the interest of time. So 3 things I'm going to cover is Christy asked me to go back and just discuss briefly what 401 is, the statutory provisions, why a rule was needed, and then again, just going to touch on a couple highlights on what's in the rule, because I think Jennifer very adequately covered it just a minute ago. So with that, first question is, what is Clean Water Act Section 401 certification? Can't talk about water quality certification without talking about water quality standards first. These, of course, are standards issued by states, a requirement under the Clean Water Act. It actually long predates the Clean Water Act, designating what the uses for their waters are and what levels of water quality are necessary to meet those uses, as well as anti-degradation. And the less said about that now, the better. So water quality standards, foundation of the Clean Water Act, foundation of 401 certification. At bottom, the 401 certification gives states an opportunity when you've got a federal license or permit that has potentially has a discharge. It gives the state the opportunity to weigh in to ensure that the federal agency isn't going to authorize an activity that might violate state water quality standards. Just one little note, and it's in the asterisk there. There is more to 401 certification in Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, but we're going to focus on this particular piece. Here's the statute. Have it here for reference. I'm not going to read it. One thing I will point out, because this confused me when I was first getting started back in the day, when we talk about Clean Water Act Section 401, we're actually talking about 33 U.S. Code, 33 U.S.C. Section 1341. So you have the statutory reference there for reference. So next, going to move on to a couple of the key concepts. Again, these are key concepts in the statute before we get to the rule itself. So this applies. What triggers 401 certification? Of course, and Jennifer said, just to reiterate, if you are an applicant and you need a federal license or permit that may result in a discharge, and for those of you that are conversant in the Clean Water Act, discharge in this concept is broader than a 402 discharge. So it applies to basically anything that water might come out of, including, for example, dams, water running through a dam. At bottom, 401 certification is a finding. People often refer to it as a permit or something else, but at bottom, it's really a finding by the state that the activity is going to comply with water quality standards or will not comply, as the case may be. Ms. Jennifer said a statute gives states a reasonable period of time not to exceed 1 year to make their decisions. States options, again, grant, deny, or waive. Jennifer, I think, covered that very well. What does the certification do? Of course, the federal agency, be it the Corps or anyone else, can't issue their permit or license unless they have a certification or waiver in the file. State conditions, as Jennifer also covered, state conditions become conditions of your federal permit. And also, this is important, can be important in advanced baseball, but a number of federal statutes and regs require a federal agency to make water quality standards findings or determinations. NEPA, for example, and 404B1 guidelines. If they have a 401 water quality certification from the state, they can generally defer to the state to make those determinations. So it takes some pressure off the federal agency. So why did EPA need to update its 401 rule? So the language is actually in Section 401, predates the Clean Water Act by a couple years. It goes back to 1970. The original rulemaking actually came from Thanksgiving Day 1971, and also predating 1972 amendments that we generally consider the Clean Water Act. In 1979, EPA actually recognized that some of the practices had diverged from what their rules stated, and they needed to update it. And it took 40 years for them to get around that to actually do that. Of course, we figured everything out in 40 years. I wish is what I could say, but in reality, more and more questions kept cropping up as to how we apply this 401 certification and how we get through the process. Just a couple questions. It wasn't clear prior to the new rule what an applicant need to actually do to start the process, what they needed to include in the application, what actually started the timeline, who determines when the reasonable period of time is up. Can that clock be reset? Is it suspended until you have a complete application or complete request? And the bigger picture questions, I think, was really politically driving the new rule was it just wasn't clear what discretion and what authority and what power 401 actually gave to states. There are a number of folks, some states, some third parties that effectively viewed 401 certification, still do, as an opportunity for states to veto federal permits. And you have a lot of examples out there, 401 water quality certification decisions based on factors that really have very little to do with water quality. Lastly, prior to the new rule, and still in many cases, there's a hodgepodge of federal and state rules out there that vary by context, that vary by state, make it very difficult to determine, if you're an applicant, what you actually need to do to get 401 certification. The only group that benefits from that uncertainty and that landscape, there's only one group, and I'm a part of it, and it's been very lucrative. And so hopefully the 401 certification rule will make people's lives a lot easier and add some clarification, and you'll need less folks like me. So lastly, going to get into a couple highlights on what's in the new rule. Of course, it was issued in last July, became effective in September. Has it been challenged? Of course, there is one pending or consolidated pending challenge to the rule. 21 states, including Maryland and Virginia, have joined the challenge to the rule. 8 states and a number of other groups have intervened to actually defend the rule. Currently, that litigation is stayed. It's on ice until EPA figures out what it's going to do with the rule. So the application process, I won't cover these slides in detail, but just to touch on the highlights. Again, you have to file that pre-filing meeting request at least 30 days in advance, ask for a meeting. State doesn't have to give it to you, but you have to ask for it, wait 30 days, file the application or the request. Very important, there's a laundry list of information. I just want to emphasize that, laundry list of information and finding specific language that must be in your request. You do not have a complete request unless that language is in there. You've checked every box that's in the new rule. So then, of course, as Jennifer said, the federal agency will give the state, within 15 days of the request, they're supposed to give the state what their reasonable period of time is going to be. For the Corps, there's a default of 60 days, although that can vary. I just had one recently where the Corps gave 120, for example. Also, federal agencies, if you're dealing with other federal agencies, they can, by regulation, set their own default. For example, FERC, if you have to deal with FERC, they've set a default of 1 year in every case. One other thing to point out, the state, of course, can ask for additional time and ask for an extension, but the applicant can request additional time as well. That may be important if you've got a situation where you're concerned the state doesn't have enough information and you'd like a little extra time to deal with that. You as the applicant can ask for more time as well. Of course, the state has 3 options. They can grant, waive, or deny. The one big sea change here with the new rule is that the state now has to provide explanations for their decisions, much more so than before. It wasn't as clear before, but they have to provide explanation for the decision and any conditions they put on a grant of 401. They need to explain the water quality, why that condition is necessary to ensure compliance with state water quality standards. Other sea change in the new rule, I just want to emphasize a couple of things that Jennifer said here, is that the new rule requires federal agencies to go in and really take a hard look at the state certification. If the state didn't comply with the rule, it was unclear before what the federal agency's authority was. Well, here the new rule is quite clear. If the state doesn't comply, then it can be construed as a waiver, and the federal agency can still issue a permit, notwithstanding the state's denial. Also, the federal agencies will do a condition-by-condition review of any conditional certification the state issues, and if a condition doesn't comply with the rule, it's not geared towards water quality, for example, they can actually deny that condition and not apply it, not incorporate it into the federal permit. Last slide here, just to wrap it up. I'm sure Trish and Heather will talk about some of the downsides of the new rule. Here are a couple of just generally positive takeaways and clarifications. It does make the process more predictable for applicants. We know exactly when the clock is going to start. You don't have examples where states in some cases have just summarily denied certification just so they could reset the 1-year clock. The new rule puts an end to that and adds more clarity. It clarifies what the state's role is in an ongoing. It was unclear before. Once a state issues certification, could they continue to enforce the conditions in it? The new rule says no. Once the certification is incorporated into the federal permit or license, it's up to the federal agency to enforce its permit conditions. Of course, there are examples. States may have independent state law grounds to enforce conditions if it's issued as a permit, VWP permit, for example. But putting that aside, the general rule is that the federal agency is responsible for enforcing 401 cert conditions. Also, it's clear the state may not revoke or amend its 401 certifications after they're issued. That's another clarification that, in my opinion, was quite needed. Lastly, it's pretty clear in the new rule, and I think this was the intent, that the states should really cabin their reviews and confine them to water quality, and not make decisions based on political considerations or other considerations that don't have to do with water quality. And with that, I will wrap it up and hand it back to Christy. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. That was very helpful. Thank you for clarifying things for us. Next up, we have Trisha Beasley, and she is pulling her slides up now. Perfect.
Christy, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I can see your slides, just not quite yet in that presentation view.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it in. There we go.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. I'm going to modify my presentation a little bit, Christy. I see that we're running behind, and
Yeah.
the first half of my presentation covering some of the nationwide stuff was covered very well by Jennifer and Justin. So when we get to those slides, everybody, please bear with me. I'll do some skipping around to speed us up a little and not provide you too much duplication of material. But thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tricia Beasley, and I manage the Virginia DEQ's Northern Regional Office, Virginia Water Protection Permit Program, and Stormwater Management Program. As the previous presenters have summarized, there have been changes to the nationwide permit thresholds, to the 401 certification rule, and there were changes to the navigable waters protection rule. These changes definitely affect how the Army Corps of Engineers and the VWP program interface. The changes do affect the regulated public and the application processes for nationwides and VWP permits in Virginia. So I'm going to try to provide you a brief overview of how the nationwide process has changed related to the VWP permit program, and then a brief overview of the state's surface water determination changes resulting from the navigable waters protection rule. While we go through this, please keep in mind that both the Corps and DEQ are still working through these changes, including what's required of each agency and how our processes will need to be modified to account for the changes, but we are working together and we are hoping to make a more streamlined process than what I present to you today. This slide is a slide I'm going to skip. Basically, all it does is recap what Jennifer went over. That says the 16 nationwides, 15 of them have that regional condition 13. And if you're above certain thresholds, which are called the water quality certification limits on the nationwides, then you would need the individual 401 certification. This slide is a summary of that same information. So as you can see, nationwides 48, 55, 56, 57, and 58 do not have any water quality certification limits. So those nationwides are the regional condition 13. The other nationwides listed on the table, if you're above those thresholds or you're doing an activity that's specifically listed there, you must initiate the individual 401 certification process. What that means, and to summarize where we're at today, is as a result of the changes and for the time being, all the projects that are proposing impacts under the 2021 nationwides in Virginia need to submit a JPA to DEQ through the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. DEQ will review the JPA in accordance with the VWP permit regulations and determine whether the proposed activities are regulated under the VWP program, are excluded from the requirement for a VWP permit, qualify for a waiver of the VWP permit, or require a permit. DEQ staff will copy the Corps and the agent and the applicant upon receipt of the application and on related correspondence so that everybody knows when the process is complete. Now, going back to the projects that specifically have a water quality certification limit that initiates the individual 401 certification process, these projects will be required to submit a joint permit application and the individual 401 certification process must be initiated. It's really important for everybody who is operating and getting coverage under these nationwides and VWP permits to recognize that the issuance of a VWP permit does serve as a 401 certification. However, the VWP permit program process does not substitute the required steps and procedures under the 401 certification rule that Jennifer explained previously. So for those projects that will require the individual certification, Jennifer went over the details of the pre-filing request and the 401 water quality certification request. But just to let those attending the webinar know, generally when DEQ receives your pre-filing request, we're going to decline to attend or have a pre-filing request, because the application, the information in the joint permit application will provide DEQ with sufficient information about the project. I recommend that you submit the pre-filing request under separate cover from the JPA so that DEQ can be sure to provide you with a specific response. We're going to be receiving a lot of information, and as I said, because we are going to decline the pre-filing request, just getting that request will allow us to respond to that directly, and then we can save it in our files. DEQ's VWP application review process will indicate our response to the 401 certification request. Staff will either provide a letter indicating that a permit is not required for the activity, or that the requirement for a permit is waived, or that a permit is required. And as I've stated previously, of course, issuance of a VWP permit constitutes the program's 401 certification. What I've provided is a very simplified summary of a very complicated regulatory entanglement. However, the short answer of submitting a JPA to DEQ will ensure that the applicant receives appropriate authorization. DEQ recognizes that the public faces significant changes in the permitting process. Examples of the changes, projects that were proceeding under Nationwide, which would have had a PCN, are now required to submit a joint permit application to VMRC. Also, the informational requirements of the VWP program applications are different than those of the PCN. In addition, for the projects that end up requiring a VWP permit, there may be differences in the impacts and compensation, and the VWP permit has construction monitoring and reporting requirements. These changes also result in a significant workload increase for DEQ. We are working internally to triage the workload, and our response times to the public may be delayed, but we will be responsive as possible. Also, it's important to note that DEQ and the Corps are working together to develop new pathways to remove the requirement to submit a JPA to DEQ for every project. So please stay tuned for changes. Given the workload implications and considering the small scale of the impacts associated with most nationwides, developing efficiencies in light of these changes is paramount to DEQ and the Corps. Also, just an end note, sorry, touched my mouse there. The 2017 nationwides that were not reissued in 2021 are still in effect, and DEQ's 401 certification is still intact. So when we talk about the new processes, just make sure you keep in mind it's only for those 16 nationwides reissued in 2021 for now. Switching topics to state surface water determinations. Another significant regulatory change in the past 12 months affecting the relationship of the Corps and VWP permits was the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The rule became final in June 2020 and changed the extent of federal jurisdiction. The state law did not change. The definition of state surface waters remains the same. As a result of the changes to the federal jurisdiction, the permitting efficiencies are affected, and projects may have permits from the Corps and DEQ with different impacts and different compensation, or they may only require a permit from DEQ's VWP program. Just of note, prior to June 2020, the definition of state surface waters under the authority of the VWP program and the definition of waters of the United States were never the same. However, prior to that date, the two authorities regulated very similar activities, which allowed for streamlined processes and allowed us to reduce duplication of effort. As a result of the changes, as I've already stated, the public and DEQ, we have to take additional steps to prevent unauthorized impacts to state surface waters, which may not be captured under the federal process anymore. As a guiding principle to the public, if there are features on your project that are not jurisdictional to the Corps, then submit a state surface water determination to DEQ. Generally, if your site receives a PJD, it will cover all state surface waters, and no additional approval or review or state surface water determination would be required for DEQ. On an AJD, however, you may have excluded waters that the Corps isn't going to be permitting, and these features may still require a VWP permit, and a state surface water determination should be requested. But of note, if your site has an AJD and the AJD happens to cover all of the surface waters on the site, then you do not need an additional state surface water determination. Again, just to reiterate, it's if there are surface waters on your project that are not jurisdictional to the Corps, then submit a state surface water determination. To initiate a state surface water determination, please submit the delineation package provided to the Corps and the surface water determination form to the DEQ regional office. From my perspective, the best time to submit the state surface water request is after the Corps' AJD process is complete, but before the submission of the joint permit application. I think this is an efficient way to go about it, because by waiting for the Corps AJD process to be complete, it allows DEQ staff to focus on the areas that the Corps' jurisdictional determination did not include, and not duplicate the field work that the Corps completed for the areas that are under their jurisdiction. If you believe you have a complicated site though, or you want to conduct a pre-application meeting during the site visit, you can schedule the site visit with the Corps and DEQ at the same time and have the determination processes run concurrently. However, please always submit a state surface water determination prior to the joint permit application. This will allow for certainty going into the permitting process, and the information is required in the application. While I had an audience here today, I wanted to just take a few moments and throw out a couple items for staff, which is for any of you submitting a state surface water determination, please consider ensuring that all of the flagging on site is intact. That way, if the state surface water determination warrants a field visit, when we go to the site, the flagging needs to be visible and present in order to confirm the boundary. Also, a table summarizing the state surface waters on site will be necessary for most sites, and also makes review much easier and more efficient. I also wanted to mention that as an agent or an applicant, you can request that DEQ concur with your wetland classifications in your stream assessments, and we can discuss and review any potential exclusions that may apply to the site during the state surface water determination process. This will provide the applicant more certainty when they submit their JPA. In addition, it will save DEQ staff time from having to review those items when the joint permit application is submitted. For those of you not involved in the delineation process, this slide is just to highlight the types of differences that can occur between the Corps' jurisdiction and DEQ's jurisdiction. All of the aquatic resources on this map are state surface waters, but the areas circled in red are excluded from the federal jurisdiction. So this is an example of a project that will have significantly different impacts and compensation between the two agencies. The changes implemented as a result of the Waters Protection Rule also increased workload for DEQ. And DEQ is conducting desktop reviews of state surface water determinations when appropriate. As with the nationwide and BWP process that I discussed in the first half of the presentation, the state surface water determination process is still a work in progress, so please stay tuned. Christy, this concludes my presentations. So at this point, I can turn it back over to you and answer any questions during our question session.
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia. That was great. Lots of information there, and I can appreciate the subject to change note on your slides as we're getting new info daily. Yeah. Heather, if you want to pull up your slides, Heather Nelson is next to give us the Maryland perspective. Perfect.
Great, thank you. My name is Heather Nelson. I'm the program manager for the Wetlands and Waterways program with the Maryland Department of the Environment. And I am going to run through most of my slides today, even though some of the information is similar. There's been a lot of discussion about Virginia's procedures, and I want to make sure that the differences between Virginia and Maryland are clear to the audience today. So my program renders permitting decisions for activities that impact tidal wetlands, non-tidal wetlands, and waterways, including the 100-year floodplain. The program also manages the mitigation projects for impacts that cannot be avoided. And we render consistency determination decisions in accordance with the Coastal Zone Management Act and issue water quality certification decisions in accordance with Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. I appreciate WSSI for inviting Maryland to participate in the webinar today, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to reach such a large audience to discuss these topics and their impact to Maryland's regulatory procedures. I know people have been very interested in the changes that they've experienced here in Maryland. When is a Section 401 certification required in Maryland? A WQC, as we call them, is required in Maryland, same as it is in any other state, as we previously discussed, whenever a federal license or permit is required that may result in a discharge. Over the last 2 years, there have been significant shifts in the implementation of Section 401 federally among several agencies, as we've heard today, EPA and the Corps specifically, that have precipitated Maryland to adjust its WQC procedures. Today, I'm going to focus on some of those changes, especially when a standard individual permit is required from the Army Corps of Engineers as the lead federal agency. How long does Maryland have to make a certification decision? While the Clean Water Act may allow up to 1 year to make a WQC decision, in the case of the Corps of Engineers, as you've heard earlier, their regulations have stated that 60 days is a reasonable time, unless the district engineer decides more or less time is reasonable. This has always been in the Corps regulations, but has been implemented differently across the nation to date. How was Section 401 different historically to today in Maryland? So in August of 2019, the Army Corps of Engineers issued a regional general letter, also known as the 2019 Regal. The Corps got back to basics with this Regal in Maryland and strictly implemented the 60-day decision timeframe for a state's decision and required states to submit written requests for extensions for certain reasons. For example, the complexity of the project, the nature of the discharge, et cetera, and discounted a state's regulatory administrative procedures associated with the processing of a WQC request. They said 60 days was the deadline unless they agreed to an extension, and it's not to exceed 1 year. Prior to the 2019 Regal, Maryland and its Army Corps district, the Baltimore district primarily, worked well together to complete the WQC process for qualifying projects. Until this Regal, the Army Corps would issue a public notice that stated a water quality certification was required for Maryland for the project, and that Maryland had 1 year to make a decision, automatically granting the full available reasonable time frame to Maryland with rarely a problem. Maryland would proceed accordingly with that review and time frame. Very little was required of an applicant for a WQC under this framework for most projects. After the 2019 Regal became effective, the well-established procedures of the Corps issuing the public notice with the 1 year time frame for Maryland to make a decision ceased, and the Corps implemented the hard deadline of 60 days to decision and the requirements for extension requests in the 2019 Regal. Maryland immediately needed to reset its WQC deck for projects received after this 2019 Regal. We decided in order to preserve our time clock to a decision, Maryland needed to also immediately institute these new WQC processing procedures. Preserving that time clock is very important to a state. It should be noted that at the same time, the new Section 401 rule, not at the same time, just a little bit before August, but the new Section 401 rule was being developed under an executive order. And Maryland participated in the rulemaking process by filing comments during the rulemaking proceedings. And you heard Justin say that we've taken some additional actions after the final rule. The new rule was issued in June of 2020 and effective September 11, 2020. And despite the various challenges to the rule in the country, until it is amended, Maryland must follow the rule. So what do you need to do to obtain a WQC in Maryland? There are 4 important steps, I think, for your awareness when planning a project. Determining when a WQC is required, submitting the pre-filing meeting request, mapping out the time clock to a decision that you need for your project for a WQC certification, and submitting in writing a WQC request in accordance with Section 401 and with our Maryland regulatory requirements. So how do you know you need a WQC? The Army Corps of Engineers, or the federal permitting agency, will tell you, based on their review of your JPA, if your project will require an individual WQC. If the Corps has told you that your project qualifies under the Maryland State Programmatic General Permit 5, as we currently are in the phase of, or in the future under the 6, if they tell you a 2017, it qualifies as for a 2017 nationwide permit in effect in Maryland, or even a regional general permit. Maryland has already issued a blanket water quality certification for those activities covered in those permits, and you do not need to obtain a WQC individually from Maryland for those projects. So it's important for you to know what the Corps is categorizing and telling you you need for this project, for your project. So pre-filing meetings. As you have heard, the new rule requires these, and you must file this meeting 30 days prior to submitting the formal WQC request. As you've heard, this is a hard rule. The Corps will ask you to provide proof of this filing with Maryland, and for proof of the date you filed the formal WQC request to ensure 30 days has passed. Maryland has created the ability to submit a pre-filing meeting request electronically on its website. For those of you familiar with Maryland tools, it is located on the same MDE Wetlands and Waterways webpage as the pre-application meeting request forms. Because we're going to send these presentations out to everybody, I did include some links in some of the slides for you. A few things about the pre-filing meeting request. It does not require, if your project does not change significantly. I'm sorry, a few things. It doesn't expire, I want to say, if your project does not change significantly. So if you file a pre-filing meeting request and your project hasn't changed, you do not have to submit a WQC request on day 31. You can. However, you could submit it in 60 days or 90 days, as long as your project hasn't changed significantly. That pre-filing meeting request is valid. When does the Section 401 time clock begin? The pre-filing meeting request does not start Maryland's review time clock. The WQC request must be mailed to MDE. We do not accept emailed requests at this time due to the 60-day Army Corps time clock that begins once we receive a WQC request. And it sounds like Virginia allows the WQC request to come in with a JPA. I want to make it very clear that a JPA is not a WC request for Maryland at all. They are completely separate procedures and request processes. So when you're planning your WQC request and your time clock, you're going to want to map out what your timeline for decision looks like for your project. Recently, we've had to do this on several big projects, and you really need to find a sweet spot to time your request because your project is going to want a favorable decision within the reasonable period of time to decision that the state has. We don't want to be butting up against that expiration of that time clock. That takes increased coordination between all parties. During a pre-filing meeting request or through discussions with the Corps, you will likely be referred to MDE's Key Elements document. MDE has created a Key Elements document that is on its website, link here, to help guide you on what a WQC request must contain. It includes all of the required statements and the project details that you'll need to submit. As discussed previously, in most cases, a WQC request with all the required request language attached to a completed JPA will be enough information for Maryland to make a WQC decision. This is by design so that we can streamline the project for most projects. For more complex projects, the JPA may not be able to cover all of the necessary information, and in a situation such as that, you will be notified by MDE, likely at the pre-filing meeting, that information supplemental to the JPA is going to be necessary. Or after a review commences, we can continue to ask for more information if we need in order to supplement your WQC request prior to making a decision. After you submit a WQC, what can you expect in Maryland? So public notice is required for water quality certification. Maryland will make every effort to combine the public notice process for a WQC with a JPA if public notice is required for that project through the JPA process. If there is not a public notice required for your JPA at the state level for your tidal and non-tidal impacts, you may have to go it alone on the WQC public notice. We also have the option of combining jointly with the Corps for public notice. So we'll look for the most efficient ways of providing public notice for this project that needs the WQC. Hearings are part of the process as well in some cases. So we'll public notice it, and if a hearing is requested, we may hold one. Sometimes you, depending on the complexity of the project, may decide to hold a notice and hearing at this hearing notice at the same time. But under Maryland's regulations, hearings for water quality certifications cannot be held sooner than 45 days from the date the notice of the hearing appears in the Maryland Register. We're going to look to update some of these WQC regulations here at the state, but for now, you want to consider this hearing time frame when you're trying to map out your clock to decision. So all of these are important steps when you're planning your timeline. Can an MDE or a requester stop the time clock? The short answer to this is no. The time clock begins upon receipt of a request and ends when MDE is going to make a decision, and we're going to need to decide to grant with condition, deny, or expressly waive your certification request. Now, if the time clock expires without a Maryland decision, the Army Corps will determine Maryland is waived, or as you heard, there's some other procedures that the Corps may go through to determine whether or not a state is waived through compliance with the Clean Water Act, Section 401 regulations. So Maryland WQC conditions do have a new look in accordance with the new rule, and they're going to be tailored to your specific project. As discussed, we'll have to write a condition. We have a statement of necessity and include a legal citation. So this is what your nice new long condition is going to look like in Maryland. We've done many of these, and so far this is our format in working to comply with the 401 rule. So that's your whole new look. What happens after Maryland issues a decision for the WQC request? For Maryland, we're required to publish the final certification decision in the Maryland Register again. An appeal period on our decision begins, it's an administrative appeal period, but it begins 30 days after the publication in the Maryland Register. But the WQC is going to be valid once it's issued. Maryland prompts postly on its Wetlands and Waterways webpage all WQCs it issues. So you can go there and take a look at them. And it'll likely appear on our website sooner than it'll appear in the Maryland Register, because there's some delays on publication of that register. It's like every 2 weeks, I think, in Maryland. After we issue a decision, we're going to send it to the Army Corps of Engineers or the Federal Permitting Agency. And then the Army Corps or the Federal Permitting Agency is required to follow the subsequent procedures under the 401 rule. We call it the A2 rule, and the new regulations double down on that neighboring jurisdiction coordination and notice. That was already discussed a little bit earlier, so I'll skip those details. So what about the Maryland State Programmatic and Nationwide Permit Activities and WQC? You might be wondering, how does Maryland's WQC fit into some of these general permits issued by the Corps of Engineers, and how is your project covered. So the Maryland State Programmatic General Permit covers approximately, gosh, I would say about 95% of activities in Maryland. It's a significant number of activities covered under that GP. And the GP6 that's in process right now is going to cover similar percentage of activities in Maryland. WQC is issued for the GP5 that's currently in effect, and we recently issued a WQC for the GP6 on March 24th, 2021, so just a few weeks ago. And if your project qualifies under the Maryland State Programmatic General Permit, then you do not need to request a WQC for Maryland. Now, you're going to need to pay attention to what the final decision and the final publication is for the Corps for the GP6 to ensure that that is still going to be the position of the Corps. We were able to coordinate better with the Corps on this GP6 than the 2021 nationwides, which I'm going to talk about next. And so we're fairly confident that the blanket, so to speak, WQC for the GP in Maryland for the 6 version is going to be accepted in full. So the nationwide permits. As you heard, there are currently 2 sets of nationwide permits, the 2017 and the 2021s. In Maryland, because of the Maryland State Programmatic General Permit, most nationwide permits are suspended for use in Maryland because those activities are captured in the MDSPGP. The 2017 nationwide permits that are still in effect in Maryland have received the blanket WQC, and an applicant qualifying for those 2017 nationwide permits does not need to obtain a WQC. They're in effect and they haven't been replaced by the 2021, so they'll expire in 2022. So you're good until then. And then I know David discussed how that is all going to work for us. The 2021 nationwide permits. After an accelerated rulemaking, the Corps reissued the 16 nationwide permits. Of the 16 2021 nationwide permits reissued, because we're covered by 2 districts in Maryland, we're covered by the Philly district and the Baltimore district. There's a little bit of difference because the Baltimore district issues our Maryland State Programmatic General Permit to us. So for that district, which is a majority of Maryland except for areas located near the C&D Canal, all of those nationwide 16 reissued nationwide permits are suspended except for 4. And I listed the 4 that are currently active for you. The 2021 nationwide permit water quality certification decision by the Corps for Maryland is an unfortunate turn of events. So unfortunately, the Corps determined that it's declining to rely on Maryland's WQC for the 2021 nationwide permits that we issued timely on December 15th, 2020. And more to come on that, I think, at different time. So what does this mean for you? So, which is what you're most concerned about. If you have a project that will qualify for one of these nationwide permits from the Corps for your project, you will need to request a individual water quality certification from Maryland and follow all the procedures and process that I've just outlined for you in this in these slides. So for the Baltimore district, it's just the 4. Unfortunately, for the areas covered by the Philadelphia district, it is all 16 nationwide permits. If your project qualifies for those, you would need to apply for an individual certification. It's a small suite of activities actually where the Philly district issues under those nationwides, but if you have a qualifying project, nonetheless, you'll need to ask Maryland for an individual certification. Again, we're evaluating our options on how best to streamline all of these procedures in requesting water quality certifications associated with the 2021 nationwide permits. We just haven't made any final decisions yet. So the proposed MDSPGP6. So as I discussed, it's out for, so the public notice was issued in November of 2020. So the Corps is evaluated and we participated and submitted comments and have been working closely with the Corps to get a a broad range of activities included in that GP6 to continue to streamline the permitting procedures here in Maryland. The Core Baltimore District expects to release the final on or about September 1st, 2021. And again, we issued the certification for the GP6 in March of 2021, and you can find a copy of that certification on our website. And I'll tell you, Maryland's encouraged by some of the additional changes to the proposed MDSP GP6. Of course, it's only a proposed GP6 and it can change, but we're still encouraged by some of the changes that we saw within it that would include more activities. For example, some of the improvements we liked were the inclusion of beneficial reuse of dredge material for living shoreline and beach nourishment projects. Maryland's a huge proponent of beneficial and innovative reuse of dredge material, so we're happy to see that it's an activity now covered under the MDSP GP. One of the important factors is that one of the important changes we hope stays is that they'll exclude temporary impacts from the impact totals for permit qualification under the MDSP GP categorization. I think that'll bring in more projects under the GP sort of streamlined permit process. They added a new activity for aquatic habitat restoration, which is a big activity here in Maryland. And just procedurally, we've noticed that when a project may go over to the Army Corps of Engineers under the Cat B or an SIP, and the project proponent is able to reduce and minimize, that we wanted a procedure or process that the Corps could then return the project back to Maryland so that we could issue a Category A for that project. So you'll get your permits a lot sooner than having to go through a Cat B or an SIP process. If you can get your project back into a Cat A, the Corps will return it to Maryland. The navigable waters rule in Maryland, I'm very pleased to say that Maryland has comprehensive state laws in place to protect and restore waterways and wetlands within its state boundaries. The big difference that we have seen outside of our existing regulatory tools are that currently ephemeral waters seem to be the only waterways which, as a matter of practice, Maryland is generally not considered jurisdictional under certain provisions of state law, but which are now excluded as jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. So ephemeral waters are not regulated by Maryland, and they're also not regulated by the Corps. So the other concern with there is a concern with the navigable waters rule for Maryland, and it centers a little bit around Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, is that the reduced scope of federal jurisdiction could also result in loss of protection that is otherwise provided for under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act when a federal license or permit is required. So we're trying to gather some data and monitor that situation as time passes to see if we need to have any sort of regulatory response here in Maryland. So due to the navigable waters rule, Maryland is much more interested in upstream states' regulatory schemes and ensuring that Maryland waters are protected and our work is advanced here in Maryland around the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. We encourage applicants to consider the option to request a jurisdictional determination from the Corps, especially if there's a conflict or a questionable decision on the waters. Maryland is going to abide by a Corps' jurisdictional determination. So that is recommended. MDE, frankly, has not really experienced a change in our process because of our robust regulatory program. So, okay, so that is the last slide. And here's my contact information. Since we're going to send these presentations out, you're welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of our permitting, 401 or CZMA, et cetera. So thank you. Back to you, Christy.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks for giving us some clarification between Maryland and Virginia. There definitely are some differences there. We are going to do a quick poll here and then turn our cameras on and open it up for questions. So it looks like we have been seeing some changes on projects. I know that we have. Okay, thanks for answering that. If I could get the session 1 folks to turn their cameras on. Thanks, Dave. Hi, Trisha. And I can start reading some of the questions that we have here. Hey, guys. Okay, let's see. These are a little bit out of order, so I apologize, but hopefully this maybe is an easy one to start with. I will pose this to Trisha. When submitting the pre-filing request to DEQ, does that go to DEQ directly, or does that go through to VMRC through VitaShare? And Trisha, you're on mute, I think.
Is that better?
Yes.
It was a good answer. I was done with it, but
Oh, good. Okay.
yeah, just for anybody, you know, who's part of these processes, one of the things that the agents, the regulated public really need to get into their minds, and Heather did a better job of calling it out in her presentation than I did, but the VWP permit process and the 401 certification process are not the same process. The rules of how the 401 certification must be initiated and the steps that must be taken are part of the 401 certification rule. And Jennifer covered that in detail. The DEQ's mechanism by which we provide a 401 cert is the JPA. So the short answer is the VWP permit, which we use the JPA to initiate. So the short answer to the question is the pre-filing request does not need to go through VMRC because it is not part of the VWP permit application.
Okay.
So it can come directly to DEQ in the Corps.
Okay, great. This is a question for Dave. Does the Corps intend to have all the nationwides run under the same cycle? So after those remaining 40 get renewed, will they all have matching expiration dates between those and these latest 2021 versions?
Yes, that is our intent. So when we issue the final rule for the 40, we will put an expiration date of March 14, 2026, which is the same as for the 16 nationwide permits we issued in January.
Okay, great. Jennifer, I'll start with you on this one. With the removal of the linear foot limits, how does the Corps propose to deal with those who delineate only a center line of a stream or only one of the banks? And then in that case, where it would not be possible to get accurate dimensional data.
Okay, so a couple of things with that one is, so in the area of proposed impact, so it might not be on the entire delineation would we need the acreage, but we certainly would need it within the footprint of the proposed impacts because that's how we have to account. And keep in mind too, regional condition 9 of the 2021 nationwides, the Norfolk district, if there's compensatory mitigation requirement, so there is a linear footage and an acreage requirement both. So I guess to answer that question is that, you know, a consultant or a delineator, if they're applying for verification, they could do, you know, an average, you know, width, perhaps. And I know I've done that as when I back in, you know, way back when I was a project manager, if there was just, you know, they take a center line and an average width to get square footage and acreage as it would be in the area of impact. So that might be an easier way to look at it, would be just doing it within the area of proposed impact. So we wouldn't necessarily ask for acreage on the entire site if there was only a small footprint where there was impact.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's see. So there's a couple questions here in regard to grandfathering. So we'll see, maybe Dave would be best to answer this. So first, can you speak about the nationwide permit grandfathering provisions as they apply to non-reporting authorizations? Sorry, I just lost where I was. Trisha warned us of this. There we go. For example, a very small impact that is under construction and proceeded without a PCN. So in this situation, for like a non-reporting or a verification, the permittee, wouldn't have a permit from the Corps.
So if we're just talking about the 16 nationwide
Right.
permits that we did in January, nationwide permit 43 and nationwide permit 51 could proceed without a PCN for under certain circumstances. So I guess the grandfathering really doesn't fit in because if there's no notification to the Corps, you can be either authorized under the 2017 version for up to a year as long as you're under contract or under construction before March 14th of 2021, or you can just proceed under the 2021. Now that may raise some differences in water quality certification, because if it's different between the 2017 and 2021, then you might have to do something different. But for the Corps' authorization, I don't think it makes a difference at all. If that makes sense.
Okay. I think so. Jennifer, do you want to add on the 401 piece at all?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to tease out whether the question is really about like the newest nationwides, the 2021, or like the grandfathering of ones that, were verified, where the Corps verified the use of the nationwide prior to, and is it under contract to commence, or has construction started? So if we verify the use of the nationwide, even if it's one that was reauthorized in March, became effective in March, if somebody was under contract to commence, we verified it was they were under contract to commence or started construction prior to, then they have that 12 months to complete the work. And then as far as like the no notification or the no PCN required for some of those nationwides, the newest ones, keep in mind there's still that burden. We still have regional conditions 13 and 14, which is the water quality cert and the CZMA, that have to be adhered to. So it may be that that whole concept of no notification in Virginia, Norfolk District might not entirely apply all the time, unless an applicant is going through and securing their VWP or a waiver. Then they might admit that. Just a matter of the burden again is always on the applicant, because these permits are already issued. All we're saying when we do a verification is that, yeah, we agree, we verify that you meet the terms and conditions, all of the terms and conditions of that nationwide.
Okay. A quick question here for Trisha in regard to the navigable waters. It looks like in your presentation, I think you had noted that a filing for state waters determination should be made after the Corps provides an AJD or PJD. And so in that case, an applicant, for example, would be waiting a couple of months to get that Corps certification, or jurisdictional determination rather, and then submit to you guys and wait for your all's approval. Can they be done concurrently to avoid a timing delay?
They can be done concurrently, and in some sites, it makes sense to have them done concurrently. For example, a site that's going to clearly have a significant portion of wetlands and streams or open water features that the Corps is not going to take jurisdiction over, then having them done concurrently makes good sense there. However, when a site is going to be covered under the Corps' jurisdiction for the most part, DEQ really can't engage in that site until we know the Corps' determination. Because if there's a wetland on the site and it is a waters of the US for the Corps, and the Corps confirms that wetland boundary, DEQ will accept that wetland boundary. So it really wouldn't make sense for one of our staff members to go out there and look at wetland A and go through where we think the line is, and then have a Corps rep come out there and maybe have a different answer, because it would be the Corps' answer in that situation that we would rely on. So that's
Right.
why, from my perspective, if we go out when the Corps is done, then we're taking what the Corps has done and we're looking at the areas they didn't cover. But it can be done concurrently. It's just that we're going to defer to the Corps, so we don't want to invest
Right.
too much upfront.
Okay. That makes sense. For an approved water quality certification being considered as part of a complete application for the Corps, and maybe I'm not understanding this question. I'm going to interpret it the way that I'm interpreting it. But so when it comes to, I think if the question is getting to the process, and when someone files a water quality certification to the state and that is under review, then what could be the timing implications on the Corps side? So kind of dually loaded here. Does the Corps, if the state provides approval or a waiver ahead of their allotted time frame, can the Corps issue their permit prior to that time frame being done? And then similarly, can the Corps move forward, even if the 401 piece is outstanding, can the Corps move forward with their process in terms of considering an application complete, doing their interagency review, and so on?
Okay, lots going on in there.
Yeah.
In that question. So to be clear, so if we are talking about, whether it's a nationwide and it's somebody is seeking general certification, meaning that they're looking at regional condition 13 to meet that general certification of the nationwide, the Corps cannot move forward with a permit decision until we have assurance that that has been completed. In the meantime, yes, the Corps has an obligation to continue moving through our processes. And I think that was like maybe my last couple of slides talking about, we still have an obligation. We still can do our Section 7 consultations, Section 106 consultations as they're needed. And our definitions for complete applications, whether it's a PCN requirements or an individual permit requirement for public notice, those are prescribed in regulation. So, and the 401 does not fall into that. Now, it's a matter of what we consider to be complete applications to move forward with our review processes versus we can't move forward with a permit decision until the 401 has been completed, if that makes any sense.
That's my understanding, Jennifer. From our experience here in Maryland, we have many projects that the Corps is moving through their process. It public noticed it. It's Maryland's obligation to public notice that water quality certification, and it's a separate process. But really, at the end of the day, the Corps, and I don't work for the Corps, but my understanding of the process, because I'm pretty intimate with it, is the Corps just cannot issue their final decision until Maryland has made a certification decision or it's been deemed waived. And so the processes can move separately, completely. But this is where it comes into that time clock to decision, and mapping out that time frame for your project and consulting with Maryland reviewers and consulting with Corps reviewers about when is the right time to ask for that certification, based on where the Corps is possibly in their review in Maryland, and then talking to Maryland about that. And this is just for Maryland. I know you're in Virginia, but anyway, that's my advice there.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities too, and so I think there should be, that and I know, the Corps and DEQ or Norfolk District are trying to work, with, and maybe there are some processes that we can help establish, some programmatic agreements where if we're doing a public notice, perhaps on our individual permit, that maybe there is some, joint public notice that, that would serve as well for DEQ, but we're still kind of working those things out and whether or not that can and cannot be done. To kind of expedite some of those time frames that are there by regulation. And I know one of the other questions, Christy, that you did ask in that, you know, long question,
Compilation.
had to do with if the certifying authority renders their decision and say they grant the 401 water quality certification, and it's, well, you know, say we gave them 60 days, or, you know, the reasonable period of time was 60 days, but they did it in 30. Well, of course, we're not going to say, well, we can't do anything for 30 days because you still have 60 more. Once that permit decision is made, or that certification decision is made, depending on where we are with everything else, whether it's
Right.
408, 106, Section 7, you know, alternatives analysis or NEPA or whatever, you know, if that part's done, we're not going to hold up. If we're done with everything else and ready to move out with a permit decision, and that was the last piece of the puzzle, yeah, we wouldn't hold up in waiting that, because we want it off our desks as much as you do.
Right. I would say in Maryland, we often issue the WQC because it'll be part and parcel of the non-tidal wetlands or tidal wetlands project review. So, you know, we'll issue that certification oftentimes ahead of the Corps' decision-making process, just depending where you guys are in your consultation.
Great. So we are running up against time, and we've got more questions coming in, and some of these are kind of about the same thing. A lot of stuff, a lot of questions in here about grandfathering for the new nationwides. And so what we'll do is sort through. We'll have a recording of all of these questions at the end of the program, and we'll all do our best to sort through these and maybe touch base back with the with our speakers, and then try and get some answers out to some of these main topics. The only quick question I was going to ask to kind of close this out of Justin or Dave or anyone else that wants to take this, but have you guys heard anything or any reason to believe that there may be changes from the Biden administration to pull back any of what has rolled out? So whether that be the 2021 nationwide permits or any changes to that 401 certification. Can we keep moving forward with what we have now, or do we think we're going to have more changes on the horizon?
We should always keep
defer to
moving
Mr.
with
Olson.
what we have now. Always keep moving with what we have now.
Totally concur, and the reason I'll give for that is that to make any changes to those 16 nationwide permits, we'd have to go through the full rulemaking process again.
Justin,
Same is true of 401. To go through to revise 401 certification, the rule is in effect. It's beyond the period that it could be amended through administrative action or through the Congressional Review Act. So the only way to change it at this point would be another full APA rulemaking. With the X factor being potential things could happen. Go ahead, please.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I'll just say that the litigation, weird things can happen in litigation, and so putting that aside, that the way to change it, if it were to be changed, would be through APA rulemaking.
Right. Yeah, and the administration currently has, is requiring review of 401. So there's options, I think, out there for this. But Maryland, just like Virginia, everybody nothing stayed here in Maryland. So we proceed with what we have before us.
Yep. Okay. Thank you guys so much. This was great. I'm going to listen to the recording later when I can actually focus more. We are going to take a quick 5-minute break and then jump right back into session 2. We have a lot of topics to cover there.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice seeing you all.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Welcome back for session 2. We're going to do a quick poll question. Ooh, it's our first trivia question. Let's see if you guys know your stuff.
Christy, you want to tell them why they should answer trivia questions?
To win free swag. Everyone likes free things. Also, in case I didn't mention it earlier, this entire presentation is recorded, and the presentation and all the slides will be posted on our website, and you'll get a link after the program ends to tell you where to go to find the presentation recording. Okay, great. So we have a lot of information to cover in session 2. This is kind of a speed round, if you will. A lot of topics, and our session 2 speakers don't have a whole lot of time. So we're kind of hitting the highlights, and then again, we'll open it up for questions at the end. So I'm going to jump right in to introducing everybody. If you want to just say hi and turn your cameras on. Oh, there's me. Let me move my screen real quick. Okay, so we have Mike Rolban, who I assume you all know, our retired founder. He is going to cover the recent mitigation credit shortages and what has been done to help alleviate this problem. TJ Masha, Director of Davie Mitigation, will cover the latest on nutrient credits. Bob Kerr, Director of our Hampton Roads Division, will provide an update on Ches Bay Preservation Act regulations. Jacob Butcher, the Environmental Compliance Manager in Maryland, will discuss the new construction general permit. And last but not least, we have Ben, our Environmental Science Manager, who is going to cover the latest endangered and threatened species news that affects our area. So let's get rolling with Mike. If you want to bring up your... I'm muted, telling you that you're muted, Mike. Mike, you're muted.
Yeah. Mike, unmute yourself. You self-muted.
Sorry. Okay. Hello again. Thanks for letting me give a talk today about the mitigation credit shortages and the price jumps that we've experienced in several places in Virginia. Next slide. We've been looking at this for the last couple of years with two different pathways for trying to solve the problem. One was through service area adjustments we'll talk about, and the other was through the Virginia Aquatic Resources Trust Fund getting more advanced credits. Next slide. So the problem has been a supply-demand imbalance. This problem happened extraordinarily in 2018 originally. The problem, we'll talk about why it got better, but then it cropped up again in 2020. And the problem expanded from Northern Virginia to the Fredericksburg area and the Richmond area, and it also affected stream credits as well as wetland credits. The problem is simple, that the demand for credits has been historically crazily variable, and it changes extraordinarily rapidly relative to the time it takes to develop supply. And the supply development process is a function of the approval process, and just simply it takes time for plants to grow. So we can't demonstrate success and get all the credits released for multiple years. What's been happening though is that development, both public sector and private sector, has been affected greatly. Number one, when there's no supply, but even worse almost is when the prices are extraordinarily volatile. So we've seen a factor of 10, for example, in Northern Virginia, from a low to a high in the last decade in terms of pricing. So for any public or private sector project, it's been incredibly difficult to budget it. So in 2018, we looked at a simple solution, which was to ask for an increase in advanced credits granted to TNC's VARDF program, the In lieu fee mitigation fund. It was supported by the building industry, both VACR, the Virginia Association of Commercial Real Estate, and the Home Builders Association of Virginia, HBAV, and all their sub-associations. And thankfully, the Corps and DEQ approved it and worked with TNC to solve that problem. So it was a great solution, we thought, a couple of years ago, until one bank got a release of credits when there was no other banks with credits in Northern Virginia, and the price went from $100,000 to $500,000. Now, the reason that happened is that there's a hierarchy in the current mitigation rule that requires, basically gives a preference to bank credits. And what that did is it created a monopolistic situation. And even when it was a duopolistic situation, with unregulated pricing, the prices were just extraordinarily high compared to historic norms. Ecologically, that's the reason it's in the mitigation rule, and it makes good sense, but economically, it caused lots of problems with projects. So in 2020, the home builders and commercial builders reached out to me talking about what in the world can we do. So we went back to the two-prong approach that we'd started in 2018 and then gave up because we solved the problem, we thought. And we, number one, asked for more ILF releases, which was achieved. This is the letter from the Department of the Army. That was achieved by DEQ and the Corps in March. So that was a great solution for a short-term problem, but it wouldn't affect when you have those monopolistic pricing. So the concept with the second prong was to increase the supply. And to do that, we want to increase the service area. And the increased service area basically gives more banks that can serve these high demand areas, and adds a geography that is typically cheaper to buy in terms of land costs or easement costs, but more critically, cheaper to restore, because a lot of these other areas have lands that could be more easily restored compared to these high growth areas where most of the good sites have been taken up already. Next slide. So the process, I reached out to Vaker and HBAV, and we created a team to work on this problem. And we focused on changing the state law that I actually worked on in 1996 that established a maximum service area size. Now, that law worked pretty well for a long time. It actually made things much better in 1996 in terms of, previously to that, it was an ad hoc decision, and we had much smaller service areas. So we had to look at that and see what could we do now that was acceptable to a broad spectrum of people. And Delegate Boliva agreed to be our patron, but he also had a caveat that we had to get broad support, both in the building community as well as the environmental community. So we had meetings with the Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources and the Secretary of Natural Resources, and created a stakeholders group that peaked at 36 members. It was a great group of people. We met many, many times, and we developed a compromise. So the next slide shows the original proposal we started with, which was basically going from what we had, which is 8-digit HUD codes, which are the little black line outlined areas, to the 6-digit HUD codes, which are entire what's known as basins, which are basically river watersheds, but they're defined differently than the river watersheds that are in Virginia code. So for example, the Shenandoah Potomac is one river watershed. The York and the Rappahannock are combined. That didn't go over so well with this ad hoc group. So we end up compromising with a smaller area that has both a primary service area and a secondary service area. And the primary service area is basically what we have now, the 8-digit HUD code and the adjacent 8-digit HUD codes in the same rivershed. But we don't have anything talking about physiographic province reductions, which have been by an ad hoc policy for the last 2 decades. And then we have a secondary service area where you can sell credits outside of the primary area. Basically, it's within the same physiographic province where the bank's located, and any adjacent physiographic province within the same rivershed. And that solves some problems like in the James, for example, where people were concerned about just getting too far away from the proximity of the impacts. This is kind of a blow up in Northern Virginia, and the yellow lines are the different physiographic provinces. Like on the right, you'll see the coastal plain and then the Piedmont, for example. So it's pretty complicated and site specific, but it was a compromise that gave us more flexibility than what we had. Next slide. This is just a copy of that section of the code. The next slide talks about the criteria. It's a little complicated. You can't use the secondary service area unless there's no available credits in the primary. Or I guess the credits have to be being priced at more than 200% of the VARDF price for that area. So that's putting a regulatory cap on pricing basically. But you have to buy a lot more credits. And we end up with 3 times the standard ratios for wetland credits and 2 times the standard ratios for stream credits. That was based on an analysis that I did using total phosphorus as a metric for ecological benefit. And we used the DQ nutrient land trading conversion rates to come up with a way to get a ratio that we were sure that from a water quality standpoint, you would not have any net detrimental impacts. And actually we rounded up on both ratios to have a net gain in ecological benefit. We also looked at the economics and found that this would force prices downward from current peaks in these high cost areas. So that was good for the development community. So that's how we created this compromise between environmental interests and economic interests. We also, at the request of the Bay Foundation and all the environmental groups, agreed to a tree canopy requirement that has to be submitted and implemented with a landscape plan if you're using the secondary service area. So that's going to help, again, local water quality. So the next slide just shows you the details of the actual law in terms of all these secondary service area requirements. And finally, I want to conclude that it's complicated, although listening to all the water quality certification issues now from the new 401 rule and the new nationwides, it's not that complicated. It's stringent, but it should dampen the pricing volatility that we've seen, and it should over time. It's going to take a lot of time to start new projects and grow these credits, but it should increase the credit supply over time. So I think in the long run, this will solve a lot of the economic problems and not hurt our environment. If anything, improve the environment in the Chesapeake Bay watersheds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks for all your help getting this done too.
Welcome.
Next up, we have TJ to school us on nutrients.
All right, jumping right in where the exact opposite thing is happening. These service areas are shrinking. So it's an interesting transition there. If you go to the next slide. So looking at, then the changes in service area are just one of a kind of dizzying array of changes to the nutrient banking program that we've seen over the last year. And you can kind of break these down as changes to how we generate credits, how crediting is done, and changes that affect how we use credits on the permittee side. So if you go to the next slide, we'll start with some changes affecting credit generation. Biggest one last year, DEQ wholesale changed the land conversion rates across the state. In most watersheds, there's a pretty severe to very severe reduction in the amount of credit or pounds of phosphorus that you're achieving for 1 acre of land conversion. I put the Potomac and the James on here. Those are high demand areas. Traditionally, in that coastal plain portion of the Potomac where land is a little cheaper, there was a large concentration of nutrient banks. That was a cost-effective way to service needs in Fairfax, Prince William County. And that's really changed with the dramatic decrease you've seen here. It's 0.63. Not the case everywhere. There are a few places where the new rates actually generate a higher credit yield, and that's something to be aware of on the permittee side. This is going to cause price to go up in most places, but not all places. Another thing is a 5% credit retirement. So if you generate a nutrient bank that has 100 credits off the top, you got to take 5 of those and retire them. Those are not available to sell. So that also further constrains the supply. A big one with respect to supply, and I'll back up and say that before these land conversion rates went into effect, DEQ saw an enormous amount of applications, I think probably over 100. And that did create kind of a glut of supply for a while, but we're kind of running through that. And if you're looking for nutrient credits, you're probably starting to see that it's getting a lot harder to find them. Contributing to that problem is the fact that we have a slower credit release schedule on land conversion banks. It used to be that when you completed your conversion and you put your financial sureties in place, you got 100% of your credits. Now that's stretched out. You get 50% up front, but you get the remaining 50% over 1 to 2 more years, depending on what you're planting. So it's going to be even more difficult for land conversion to kind of keep up with the demand in many areas. And so if you're on the permittee side, I would encourage you to be very proactive in looking for credits, thinking about supply, perhaps earlier in the process than you normally used to. One note about stream restoration, I'm not sure that this is necessarily codified in the nutrient credit certification regulations anywhere, but in practice, DEQ is, and I think this is true on the MS4 side as well, they are requiring site-specific bulk density and soil nutrient content, which has the effect of drastically reducing the amount of credits that you're generating from a stream restoration project. Scientifically, it makes a lot of sense, but right or wrong, the effect is that it is diminishing supply some. You can go to the next slide, Christy. So I think I have like 3 minutes left, and there's no way that we can really get into the service area stuff. It is pretty complicated. Just want to, if you take nothing else, just know that you should kind of think ahead about this. It could cause some problems, and you want to be aware that it's an issue. If you go to the next slide, basically the question that you're going to want to be asking if you have, if you're working on a VSMP permit is my project draining to an impaired water or applicable impairment, or is it inside of an applicable local TMDL? Applicable would be impairments for nutrients, sediment, benthics, dissolved oxygen, and chlorophyll A, I believe. If your land disturbing activity is not draining to impaired water, it's not within a local TMDL, okay, great. You go to the kind of standard rules for nutrient credit service area. You can go anywhere in the same or adjacent hub. But if you are within an impaired water, it gets a little more complicated. DEQ is putting out some guidance on this, and I think we're all kind of figuring this out as we go. It's just something that you should be aware of. I'll talk you through an example on the next slide. So here you've got two nutrient banks that are symbolized by the trees. You've got the land disturbance activity with the little house there. You're supposed to trace your discharge down to the first assessed stream segment, so first assessed under the 303D program. In this example, you follow the stream down to the first assessed stream, which happens to be impaired. So, okay, immediately that triggers the new impaired waters service area hierarchy, meaning you got to start by looking upstream first, and then there's kind of a checklist that you go down. If you can't find anything upstream, you can go anywhere in the same 12-digit HUC, 10-digit, 8-digit. In this example, you follow the discharge down to where it meets impaired waters. You look at that nutrient bank on the top, and the receiving waters, where it hits the impaired water, it is downstream of where the land disturbing activity impacts the impaired water, so it would not be eligible. So in this case, you'd only be able to utilize nutrient credits from that bank that's to the right there. And that is a whole new world for anyone that has used credits or sold credits, to get to that level of specificity on exactly what you can and can't use. Go one more slide. Just want to leave you with this, and I think this is also still developing, and it'll probably be featured in the guidance that DEQ is working on. There is an opportunity to make a presentation or make a case saying that your project is not causing or contributing to an impairment, meaning you would not have to follow the stricter service area hierarchy. You could just go to a same or adjacent 8-digit HUC. And DEQ has some materials here. I'm not going to go over them word for word, but just be aware that just because you're discharging to an impaired water doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have to face this. There might be a way to make a demonstration that says it doesn't apply in your case. If you get one more slide, great tool to be aware of. DEQ has been developing this for a while. It is live, I believe. We put a link in the presentation here. It does a good job of showing you the location of banks, the location of applicable impairments and TMDLs, and just helping you kind of navigate what your options are. Ribbits obviously is an available tool, but it's not going to have the element of impairments and local TMDLs. And DEQ, from what I understand, is committed to keeping this tool updated fairly frequently, including the supply at different nutrient banks. So I encourage folks to use that as a tool as they're looking for options. And we've run out of time, but hopefully if anyone has questions, we'll have some time at the end.
Thank you, TJ, and we will make sure that link is available when we post these presentations. We have Bob up next to talk about Ches Bay.
Thanks, Christy. So I'm going to be talking about the proposed amendments to the Chesapeake Bay Act. It covers two different issues. The first is preservation of mature trees and planted trees as a water quality protection tool and habitat benefit. The second one is the coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change requirements. I'll explain kind of the history of these in a minute, but they're coming from House Bill 504, which was approved in 2020. The governor approved it during the pandemic, and as a consequence, provided additional legislation that expedited the regulatory process and reduced the stakeholder involvement, or eliminated it initially, and reduced the public comment period to 60 days, as you see here. Next slide. There was a lot of written comments to the State Water Control Board back in late 2020 to ask for additional time, and a stakeholder advisory group. Those historically have worked very well, as you heard from Mike. They work very well in Virginia. There's a good history of that. So the State Water Control Board allowed for a single SAG meeting. It's actually going to be a day and a half, May 13th and 14th. takeaway on this slide is just that the public comment period is ending May 3rd, which is about 2.5 weeks away. There will be a SAG meeting, and then the State Water Control Board will decide on the final regulations in June. So this is kind of the lightning round of regulations. Next slide. With regard to the proposed tree amendments, there are a couple provisions that exist in the Chesapeake Bay Act to preserve indigenous vegetation. You can prune and remove dead, diseased, dying trees in the RPA, and that's about the depth of the regulation as it exists. The proposed regulation is to preserve mature trees as much as possible. And the first thing that people notice is there is no definition of mature trees. So that has to be worked out. There's also really no process for how to ensure you're preserving trees to the maximum extent practicable. This is a good example of, if you're trying to build a road or driveway in your RPA resource, what is minimization? How do you maximize it? The other thing I want to back up, the preservation of mature trees is not just for the RPA buffer, it's both for the RMA and the RPA, so the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed in a regulated community. So the rules are pretty extreme, or pretty broad in application. They also want you to plant as many trees as possible into buffers, including in intensely developed areas, which is new. There is not, at this point, any water quality benefit to this. The regulation was to preserve these trees for water quality and ecological benefits. One of the things we want to push for is to get some water quality credit out of that if possible. On the sea level rise and climate change, there are a lot of issues. I'm just going to kind of literally hit the highlights here. There are no existing provisions, so this is something new. It certainly wasn't envisioned back in the 1990-89 period when it was created. The first three bullets are what is allowed to localities without basically any restriction. One is expanding the RPA. The second is adding restrictions to a development. And the third is requiring installation measures to your project. So if you come in to build, say, a BMP in an RPA with an outfall, they have the ability to evaluate your RPA, determine if there's sea level rise adaptation issues that should occur, and then ask you to implement them on your project. One of the other interesting things is it creates a new buffer on the buffer. They're asking for no development within 100 feet of the RPA buffer. I think there's going to be a lot of pushback on that. And projects that solely are intended to increase elevation within an RPA must be rejected unless you add an adaptation measure to it. So if you're an industrial facility or commercial development or a residential homeowner with waterfront property, and you're having some erosion problems from overwash, waves, that kind of thing, and you want to lift your property, as it's written, you would be prohibited unless you add some form of adaptation to that project. So there's a lot of issues with this regulation. It's very broad, it's not real specific, and there are no grandfathering provisions. So again, bottom line is get your comments in by May 3rd and stay tuned. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Bob. All right, next up we have Jacob to talk about the construction general permit in Maryland.
Good afternoon, all. Today I will be providing a brief overview of the upcoming issuance of the Maryland general permit for stormwater associated with construction activity. MDE issues the general permit for stormwater associated with construction activity on a 5-year cycle for construction projects that are greater than 1 acre in disturbance and have been designated by the EPA or MDE as needing permit coverage. The current permit expired on December 31st, 2019. The new permit, which will replace the expired permit, is referred to as 20 CP. The public comment period for the 20 CP was closed on December 24th, 2020. You can find the tentative determination of 20 CP on MDE's website. It has been expressed by MDE that they are working on evaluating all comments on the tentative determination copy of the 20 CP at this time. At this time, permittees are still following the requirements of the expired permit, even though MDE is technically not issuing new permit coverage under the expired permit. In order to obtain approval for a new discharge for construction activity in Maryland while the permit expired, the permittee or operator must agree to the declaration of intent issued by MDE on May 18th, 2020. To put it simply, the DOI states that the permittee will follow the requirements of the expired permit. The DOI can be read, reviewed, and signed on MDE's e-permits portal as part of the notice of intent application. Any approvals that were issued while the permit was expired and prior to the consent order also need to agree to the DOI. Over the next two slides, I'll be identifying and discussing the anticipated significant changes. Overall, MDE has overhauled the permit layout to make digestion much easier and keep similar material together. Let's dive into some more specific changes. Once finalized, there will be an approved list of chemical additives for sediment control. This list includes anionic and cationic polymers such as flocculants. In order to utilize these chemicals, you must disclose the intended use on the notice of intent application for CP20 permit coverage. Additionally, pollution prevention section of the CP20 has been expanded to include specific control requirements for equipment, fueling, and maintenance, chemical storage, managing and storing construction waste, and other various potential sources of pollution. On the next slide, when the 20 CP is enacted, permittees have two options in the frequency of erosion and sediment control self-inspections, and a runoff producing storm event has been defined as a 1/4 inch in 24 hours. Operators and permittees will now have the option to perform an inspection on a weekly frequency with post-rainfall inspections or every 4 business days. For projects that discharge to Tier 2 waters, will be required to perform inspection once every 4 business days and after a rainfall event. Under the 14 GP, a stormwater pollution prevention plan was not required. Once enacted, the 20 CP will require the permittee to develop and maintain a SWIP if the project has one or more of the following activities on site: chemical additives or polymers, known potential for unprohibited non-stormwater discharges, or sharing liability between and among operators on the same site. In addition to the above mentioned increased inspection frequency, projects that discharge to Tier 2 waters will have to complete an anti-degradation review/checklist. The checklist affirms the increased inspection frequency, existing stabilization requirements, and additional controls if work is required in the stream protection zone. And what to do when the 20 CP is issued. Those with permit coverage under the 14 GP will need to continue their coverage, will have to log into the e-permit portal and submit a request for continuation within 6 months of the 20 CP being enacted. Operators in need of new permit coverage after the 20 CP is finalized and enacted will need to submit a notice of intent on the e-permit portal at least 60 days prior to starting construction activity. At this time, MDE has not disclosed an anticipated date for final determination of the 20 CP. And that is all I have for this afternoon. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jacob. Last but not least, endangered or threatened species with Ben Rosner.
All righty, thank you. This is the presentation you've all been waiting for because it's the last one, right? So we'll focus here on migratory birds and a new regulation here in Virginia. Wanted to make sure you had something to tweet about after all this. Anyway, so here's the deal. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources has a new regulation going into effect on July 1st, 2021. This regards incidental take of migratory birds in Virginia. And it's basically going to require permits for certain activities, either a general permit or an individual permit, depending on the type of activity, for any impacts to migratory bird species. So why is this happening? It's basically picking up where the federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act has left off. Under the Trump administration, you may recall that a lot of the rules were rolled back. Basically, there was sort of an end to what we were calling incidental take, and they said, hey, if your activity doesn't have the purpose of actually taking birds, which means hunting, harassing, harming, killing in some fashion, then you don't need to really address the Treaty Act with an incidental take permit. So Virginia, as far as we know, is the only state that has stepped in with something on the state level. for migratory birds. And just in general terms here, basically they're going to have 8 sector-specific permits, either general or individual, and it's going to affect these 8 specific sectors: commercial, industrial, oil and gas, methane burner pipes, communication towers, electrical transmission or distribution lines, wind or solar projects, and transportation projects. So if you are in one of those industries, you have a project that is in one of those industries or sectors, I should say, know that this is coming. If you are not specifically listed as one of those sectors, you are, the way they've written the rule, excluded. And they've specifically mentioned agricultural activities, and under the final revision, they also included residential activities. So if you're not specifically listed, you don't have to worry about it. So now kind of the next step comes, though, is they need to actually develop these specific permits and what's going to be triggered, what are going to be the requirements of the permits. So, you know, we know we've got this overall framework, but we still don't know what the details exactly are going to be. So those are going to be developed here starting after July 1st, after the regulation goes into effect, and we'll be able to see exactly, you know, what's going to be required in terms of what's going to trigger the permit, what might monitoring requirements be. So, you know, there are some options for some of the bigger industries. I'll say, like for electrical transmission, it may be something that you may be able to write into your annual standards and specs instead of actually having to get, you know, individual permits, say, for each project you have. So they do have some options, but I think this is going to affect a lot of folks. We at Wetland Studies, we are going to be on the board, or the committee, I guess, that's going to be putting the permit types together. So we'll have input. So hopefully we can, you know, hear from you all and kind of help guide the process so that it does not become too onerous for applicants. So that's everything there on migratory birds in Virginia. A couple other things, a quick mention: recent final publication in the Federal Register for critical habitat for 2 species, the yellow lance and the candy darter. The critical habitat goes into effect here in May 7th for the candy darter, which is a fish, in case you didn't know, and the yellow lance goes in May 10th, and that's a freshwater mussel. But this affects a number of watersheds in Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, and Virginia. So for the yellow lance, for example, Patuxent River watershed is going to be affected in Maryland, Rappahannock, Rapidan, South Anna River, Johns Creek in Virginia, and then let's see, Nottoway, Tar, Sandy, and Swift, Fishing Creek, and Little River in North Carolina. For the candy darter, they've got some kind of broader watersheds: Greenbrier, Middle New, Upper New, and Upper and Lower Gauley in West Virginia and Virginia. So those will be some kind of different things to deal with if you're working in those watersheds. If you're going to be impacting any of that critical habitat with, say, a stream crossing, or even if you're doing work in those watersheds, some of them are you know, giving concern to if there's pollutant discharges, for example, for the yellow lance and some of those. So, you know, there could be some broader effect. I know in Virginia, at least, we haven't had to deal too much with critical habitat. So this is a bit of a new thing, and it's kind of spread out here throughout the state. So with that, just remember big bird and migratory bird rules. Changes are coming.
Thank you, Ben. I think we've got another last trivia question, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Ooh, maybe this is a tough one. Oh man, Indiana bat. That is wrong. The answer was Eastern cougar. If I could have the session 2 speakers turn their cameras on and we can, good job, Robbie, and we can open it up for questions. I will start off here. It looks like, TJ, perhaps the first question is for you. How does the hierarchy work for public agencies that have to abide by the VPPA requirements of having more than one bid, depending on preliminary costing, and having to take the low bids?
Well, that's a good question. I think if you're a locality that is surrounded by a lot of impairments, or not to pick on Harrisonburg, but like living inside of a local TMDL, it is going, you are going to be limited in your options. I don't see any outs for localities. I know, for instance, VDOT's been a pretty active participant in the drafting of the guidance. I would say that they're probably pretty concerned with that same question. But I don't think there's a great answer. You would just have to put, you'd have to look at whether you're, at the end of the day, whether you're complying with the rule. And you can only, if there's only one bank that is upstream and you want to use nutrient credits, you may not be able to get multiple bids. And it might be a sole source type of scenario.
Sure. Thanks, TJ.
Yep.
I have a quick friendly note from Sarah Woodford, just noting our neighborhood DEQ mitigation specialist, just noting that the existing mitigation bank sponsors must coordinate any request for a modification to your geographic service area with the core and DEQ chair for your bank. Concur? Yes.
Totally concur. Yeah, I responded in the email thing, and
Great.
TJ's got, his team is working actually on doing that as a template so it can be done easily, because hopefully we'll be able to encourage most bankers to do that to help the industry.
Great. For Bob, what about using BMP facilities to mitigate for RPA impacts in lieu of planting additional nursery stock?
As the regulation's written, there is no allowance for that. It really right now is written as a mature tree preservation and mitigation, I would assume, program for trees. As it's written, there is no ability to provide either additional water quality benefits or get water quality benefits out of preserving mature trees. It's a good question, just unfortunate it's not available yet.
Sure. Couple more here, I think, for you, Bob. Can we expand on what was meant by the 100-foot buffer being provided on the already 100-foot RPA buffer? When would that apply?
Yeah, yes, that's actually written into the regulation. So what they were saying is that the localities would have the ability to require no development or no construction activities within 100 feet of the RPA. So it effectively would function like an RPA on the RPA, or a buffer on the buffer.
What's interesting is that was actually Bob proposed in the late 80s and rejected, but it's back.
Let me also, just on that first question about the water quality, I mean, that's something I'm sure will come up in the SAG, this larger group. I'll certainly be bringing up items like that, this question of how can we make it flexible for additional water quality trading on site.
Okay. Question here for you, Ben, in regard to ETS, utility scale solar farm in Virginia. When is the earliest new regs could stop or burden such a project?
Right, so the regs itself go into effect July 1, but no permits will be required until these sector specific permits are actually written. So it's going to be some point after that. DWR has indicated they don't have a ton of bandwidth to develop these anytime, quickly. They're going to start with the low-hanging fruit. So like communication towers is probably one they're going to start with, just because there's already guidance out there from like Fish and Wildlife. So I anticipate that some of these it's going to take a little bit of time. They've also noted that any project that's under active construction won't need a permit. So if you've got a project and you're starting, you know, July 2nd or something, and you're not going to be done for a couple months, you've got some time, and as long as you're active, it's not going to require these new permits. So.
Okay. I've got another one for you, Ben, and then Jacob, one for you after that. So for Ben, for Virginia's migratory bird rule, are there species that are excluded from the regulations, including invasive or nuisance species like European starlings?
Yeah, it's got to be considered a migratory bird. So my recollection on this is that they are going by the official, you know, migratory bird list. So, you know, resident species or, you know, invasive species that are already excluded from that list would not be included.
Okay. Jacob, there was mention on a time frame on complying with the 20 GP if you are already working under an NOI with the 2015 GP9. The one expired on December 2019. Can you expand on that? This audience member had noted that they missed what was said on the 6-month timing reference.
Yeah, so if you have permit coverage under the expired permit right now, and the 20 CP is approved and enacted, you'll need to log into the e-permit portal, access your NOI application, and apply for continuation within 6 months of the 20 CP being enacted.
Great, thank you. I am not seeing any other questions right now. While we get a few seconds to see if any others come in, do any of these session speakers have questions for each other on their topics? Mike, we know you're burning.
No, I'm fine. I would not do that to anybody.
I think that's it. I think we were actually able to get through all the questions for this session. I just want to say again, thank you all so much. I know this was a bit of a speed round and there was a ton of information covered in session 1. Like I said earlier, any other questions we were not able to get to, we'll do our best to try to answer on the website. Just a reminder in regard to the CEUs, you'll get an email after this concludes, and just fill out that evaluation form. There'll be instructions on where to send it, and we will get you a certification so you can get your credits. Thank you all so much for participating.